Could I now ask the representatives who are prepared to just summarise the outcomes of the 5 discussions to come and sit up here?
Okay, so we had a fairly wide-ranging discussion, so I'm going to try and summarise it. So initially we asked the question, what is their purpose? If they're fit for purpose, what is that purpose? And we decided that often that was unclear and it was ill-defined. We had a go. It was pointed out that probably at least initially they were conceived in order to pay back farmers for perceived loss of production due to actions that they took that had a societal benefit, public benefit, and they were incurring a cost. So we decided that was probably their initial aim. However, that success is often poorly measured, it's hard to measure, and where it has been measured, the outcome has been found to be below expectations. We identified some possible reasons for why these schemes often fall short. Often they're too short term. In order to see a real change in the system can take decades. They're too blunt and generic. The sort of policy kind of developed across the whole of Europe, whereas actually farming in like Cornwall is very different to farming in Scotland, and we need very much more targeted, none of this one-size-fits-all policies. We need targeting, and we need our whole systems to be connected. Basically need local solutions to meet the local markets. Also, a lot of the schemes are sort of focused on managing features, restoring a feature rather than restoring a system, which is kind of possibly the wrong way to look at it. And as a result of these kind of failures and problems with the system, their actual purpose has kind of become warped, and now they're often really used as a subsidy for farmers to enable them to continue to produce, and the production itself is at a loss often. So actually maybe what we're doing is allowing farmers to keep running their farm at a loss, and really we're just subsidising the supermarkets, allowing them to pay ridiculously low prices by subsidising the activities of the farmers. So that's kind of perhaps what they've been warped into. We sort of thought, how likely was it to change? What are the barriers to change and like increase their success? Politically, it's a problem. There's politically sort of environmental issues, particularly about to the next election, are fairly low down. So like you're looking at health, you're looking at the economy. Even with the rise of the Green Party, it was pointed out that actually it's a lot of their social policies more than their environmental policies that they're being backed on. Also public perspective, so there's been studies where people have been surveyed, what do they value, and there's a kind of growing trend towards people themselves valuing a more tidy landscape and actually not valuing these natural wild ecosystems which some of these agri-environment schemes are trying to create. And then it was also pointed out the role of supermarkets and people's purchasing being controlled once they're in the supermarket, so they could have all the best intentions, all the best understandings, and yet they go into a supermarket and their final purchasing decision and whether they go for an environmentally sound project might be affected. So that's perhaps quite negative. It was also sort of pointed out that, so we're talking about agri-environment schemes in terms of what happens under Pillar 2, but actually the majority of CAP funding goes to Pillar 1, so maybe we should be looking at Pillar 1, which is the single farm payment, and that itself is very broad, not very focused, and sort of a lot of the money is just really for not breaking rules as opposed to positive action. We can probably end on a slightly more positive note in that it can be successful. There are successful cases where there have been agri-environment schemes implemented that have worked. It requires engagement with the farmer, and it's not just focusing on the economical argument, it's actually getting that willingness, that understanding, and not just trying to sort of bribe them in a way with money. It's sort of this discussion that has to go on. But the problem is with that the money for that sort of dialogue and that sort of communication and that sort of assessment has been cut of late, which is kind of leading to sort of overall disenchantment with agri-environment schemes. So.
Thank you very much. That's the style guide for the others to follow. So table 2. I'm tempted to ask if anybody violently disagrees, but I don't think we've got the time. But we can have that at the end.
Thank you, Patrick. Well done. Thank you very much. Our subject was carbon sequestration, and I figured that we'd have a really good discussion about this to start off with. Especially, well, bearing in mind that nothing on my job description mentions anything about carbon sequestration, so I thought I'd be a rapporteur, and that'd be great. There's a man on my table who's got 350 scientific papers published. Everything would be just fine. What was really interesting for us was that we couldn't we couldn't sort of get a conclusion really to whether or not carbon could be sequestered by growing grass crops. And it was interesting because as soon as we started to break things down, we realised that it depended very much on whether it was an intensive system, whether it was an extensive system, whether it was permanent pasture, lays, what effect ploughing had, and so on. So it was a sort of mixed review. We also thought about what effect would have on carbon sequestration depending on the output that we required. So, for example, if it was a matter of providing forage, that might be one thing. If it was a matter of providing soil organic matter, that would be another. If it was a matter of providing a habitat for flora, fauna, birds and insects and so on, that would also be different. So really I think what we did agree on, what we felt quite strongly about, was it was a really complex issue, and it's really difficult to have a yes and no black and white answer as much as we would like to have had one. So, so that was that. I think what was easier was the second part of our question, which was asking whether deep-rooting grasses, herbs and legumes would in fact have the potential to assist carbon sequestration. And suddenly we became more animated and we felt there were a lot more answers here. So we felt that deep-rooting plants, whether they be legumes or herbs or grasses, because of course some grasses are deep-rooting, would have a bigger effect on carbon or locking up carbon deeper in the soil. Although we don't have the evidence for that, there was a sort of feeling that that was the case. Also that deep-rooting plants would reduce compaction, and that would have an effect on greenhouse gases as well, in other words making the soil behave differently. We appreciated that nitrogen-fixing legumes would have a direct impact, not only because they fix nitrogen, but also it would mean that you wouldn't be manufacturing nitrogen fertiliser if you could utilise legumes more fully. And one of the things that perhaps was more important over this was the sort of resilience factor. And that has been mentioned a little bit today, but resilience in so many ways, whilst it's not a silver bullet to have these sort of combinations of grasses, legumes and herbs, it was discussed that it would offer a large defence against variable weather, and as we know, especially in the UK, there is tremendous variance, so that's a very positive thing. And also would have an effect in rotation against blackgrass, as an example, which is an issue on farm at the moment. And so it presented itself as perhaps being an alternative to other break crops in arable rotation, so it'd be useful to arable farmers. So it might be an alternative, for example, to oilseed rape. We also realised that if a grass, legume and herb mix, or any combination of these, was to go onto arable farms, or to be used in other places where it wouldn't naturally be used, then without livestock, in other words, then there would need to be some form of utilisation of the material that it produced. And so there was talk of mob grazing, with bringing in, using animals to defoliate the material. It might be that flying flocks could move around arable areas, as they used to do in the old days. Anaerobic digesters were mentioned as being a possible way of utilising the biomass that this would produce. There was also talk of cover crops, which of course could, doesn't have to be a grass lay used in a conventional sense. It could be a cover crop, adding nutrients, adding soil organic matter, adding soil structure. And the positive message would be really from this discussion was that it would potentially increase yields, not decrease them. It would potentially be beneficial for farmers, and it would be, you could categorically say yes, it would be helpful and beneficial. But I don't know whether we answered the question on carbon sequestration directly. And I must say, as an individual, having read books like The Carbon Fields and other material in the past, I was very surprised today to come along to find actually maybe this wasn't quite as straightforward as I thought it was going to be.
Great,
Okay.
fantastic. Table 3.
Yeah. So our question was, is mixed farming going to increase or lessen negative externalities? And our gut feeling is that actually mixed farming is probably a good thing, but it's quite difficult to predict the profitability of introducing mixed farming. We thought when we were thinking about this that if we do act locally, actually we are thinking globally and wider than that. And really, introduction of mixed farming may be difficult where the farm scale is not sufficiently big enough to be able to get the economies of scale, that there may be not skills on an arable farm to deal with livestock, and vice versa. The infrastructures, the lack of fencing, the lack of buildings, all may make that difficult. We thought that you can't really have sustainable agriculture unless you also have a sustainable consumers and a sustainable supply chain. We think that where we've got to now is because actually many farmers don't farm chemically very well, and that's leading to the high usages of pesticides and herbicides, and that's why mixed farming and alternative ways of cropping farming should be considered, and that's probably sufficient.
Great, thank you very much, Sue.
Thank you. Table 4, we were answering the question, eat less meat, which meats and why, and we had a great conversation. It's very hard to summarise it. I hope the people around my table will bear with me. I hope I reflect the diversity of the conversations that we have with some of the key points here. So we started talking about what do we mean by better meat? What might we want to hold up as encouraging people to eat more of? Outdoor reared, pasture fed, free range. There was a question about quality. What do we mean by that? The need to use the whole of the animal, which will mean you have all kinds of different cuts. It may not be the great steak that some people always associate with quality. In terms of what may be less better, what we may want to move away from, various terms. Cheap meat, I think someone else called it something else beginning with a C, but less politely. Meat that's produced from animals fed on concentrated feed. Talked about intensive chicken and pork in particular, and what were called unsustainable systems that depend on antibiotics, for example. In terms of why, lots of good evidence, we've had a lot of that today. In terms of health, there's now good evidence that diets that have moderate amounts of animal foods, relatively low amounts, are healthier. We talked about a lot of challenges. Are we talking here about the UK or are we talking globally? And how do the two relate to each other? And if we can't act unilaterally here in the UK, the challenge of trying to act globally, what is the right level? Have we got enough advice and information on that? How do we encourage different consumption? How do we encourage different production? And some great conversations, the irony that food is too cheap, a lot of conversations around true cost of production. It's too cheap, and yet there are still so many people now who are struggling to eat well, despite the fact that food is too cheap. How do we move to take into account the true cost of production and consumption is not included? And what would it take to create the kind of culture change, the social norm in which we're talking about healthy and sustainable diets? Very big challenges. And at that point, it's not always easy to see where to start, but we had a go. We said, okay, given all those complexities, given all those challenges, where could we start? So some points that came out of that was about reducing consumption overall. Yes, food is too cheap and we waste an enormous amount. If we ate the right amount, it would be the right amount for health and it would have far less pressure on the environment. The need to make good food more available and accessible. Talking about starting at the level of the consumer. Education came up, particularly the young, about cooking. Talk of one diet for the world, which is about cooking everything yourself. But also there's different audiences. We can't really talk about the consumer. There's a huge number of audiences. The conversation came about men and men's relationship to meat. Something I'm particularly interested in is understanding that. Are we ever going to... I think that last presentation was really great. You know, we talk about social science and understanding people and starting with where people are. Huge amount of opportunities for more research there. And then some practical stuff about market innovation towards plant-based alternatives. And also thinking about what farmers might need in terms of sharing good knowledge. Pasture Fed Livestock Association talked there about the work that they're doing to share knowledge and to understand the barriers to more farmers engaging. So a lot of food for thought on our table. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Richard?
Well, we looked at the same question about which meats to eat and why from a slightly different perspective, looking at resource use but also at human well-being, so there's a certain amount of crossover. We identified cardiovascular diseases, cancer and diabetes as the major health threats that humans should be concerned about when they're trying to decide which meats to eat. We were all agreed that processed meats are was one of the obvious ones that we should be avoiding. We didn't know quite why. There are three theories. It could be the nitrosamines, the link between the nitrates used in curing processed meats and things in the stomach. It could be the acrylamides which are produced when red meats cook sometimes, and it could be the heme iron in red meat, what gives meat its red colour. And on that point, we noted that red meat, most people think of red meat as being beef and lamb, for example. Scientists include pork in that, even though it's only got a lower quantity of heme iron. So when you get studies saying that red meat is causing something or other, quite often they don't distinguish between the source of what type of meat. So you could have the actual problem might be coming from intensive pig production, when in fact the implication would be that all forms of red meat were equally harmful. We noted also that in general the studies which have pointed to red meat as having a range of health effects don't look at how that meat's being produced. So if there is a benefit from grass-fed meat, which is something which has come up a number of times today, and I'll mention again in a moment or two, that's not something which is going to be picked up in these studies, so that we could be throwing the baby out with the bathwater essentially by not recognising that the way meat is produced has an impact on this. We also talked a bit about saturated fat and noted that there's perhaps still uncertainty about that, yet despite that we've actually gone through a 30-year experiment where scientists in the 1980s were so convinced that saturated fat was the prime cause of coronary heart disease that they've pushed us into a huge dietary experiment, which has actually led to increased consumption of sugar, increased consumption of trans fats for the last 30 years, which may well have done more harm than the saturated fats from meat would have done that we were previously consuming. We're left with a few questions about whether grass-fed meat actually has got a wider range of micronutrients. And a number of micronutrients have been mentioned today, but we weren't quite sure about how different range of micronutrients you get from grass-fed meat. We noted the points that have come up about concerns for the diets of young women who will be getting lower consumption of milk, quite often lower consumption of red meat, and higher consumption of sugar in their diet, which is particularly worrying. On broader environmental issues, we noted that in general, grazing livestock systems could manage to produce their own nitrogen. They could manage with lower levels of phosphates and still be productive. They're not going to be causing significant damage to soil unless they're very badly managed, and they could be enhancing soil quality, and they don't require huge amounts of water. Whereas on the other hand, intensively produced meats, whether they're beef, poultry or pork, are going to have a high demand for all those four inputs. They're going to be using non-renewable nitrogen, they're using more phosphates, they'll be damaging the soils in the long term, and they'll be using water, the sort of piped water, which is a finite resource. We're left surprisingly, a little bit confused about the grass versus grain. We've heard the evidence today that there's clearly evidence that we get better levels of polyunsaturated fat balances in grass-fed meat, but we're still a little bit confused about whether we can actually go around saying that definitely means it's going to be better for health. We noted that poultry is a major source of Campylobacter food poisoning, whereas beef is not, but we also noted that you can get problems with O157 E. coli. Looking at antibiotics, which we thought were a finite resource as well in a way, because there's only a certain number of antibiotics that can be developed. We've been overusing those, and that's got a number of problems, particularly antibiotic resistance, and we're pretty sure that the use of antibiotics in pigs and poultry production is more significant than in beef and sheep production, though dairy farming use may also be unsustainable. And I think we also noted that there was a sort of disconnect between the public perception of the sort of countryside they want. If we thought about Countryfile, for example, it very rarely put its cameras on a intensive pig farm or a field with tram lines in when it was in an opening shot. It's almost always a rural landscape with animals grazing. And there's a disconnect between that, the sort of countryside we want to live in, and the meats we've been told are healthy for us, the white meats from intensive farming systems. And that's something which is a little strange. We also touched on fish farming and whether that was a sustainable thing. We note that we're unsustainably fishing the oceans, and that the farm fish have welfare and potentially nutritional issues as well. Thank you.
Right, well, thank you all very much.